Imagine you're handed a tough job. Build a brand new community from the ground up, right in the middle of a chaotic, even hostile city. I mean, where would you even begin? Well, it turns out that almost 2,000 years ago, a document was written to do exactly that. Today, we're diving into First Timothy, an ancient letter that's basically a detailed blueprint for building a community designed to last. And really, that's the central question this letter was written to answer. This wasn't some theoretical exercise, not at all. It was a high-stakes, real-world guide for a young leader who was facing a massive crisis in one of the Roman Empire's most challenging cities. So let's set the scene. The city was Ephesus, and this new community was in some serious trouble. You've got internal disorder breaking out, you've got an invasion of strange and divisive ideas coming in from the outside. The text calls them useless myths and speculations. And as if that wasn't enough, Ephesus was the world headquarters for the incredibly powerful cult of Artemis. So the pressure, both from the inside and the outside, was just immense. So that's our starting point, a community in crisis. And the letter we now call First Timothy was the direct response. It was the manual sent in to restore order and lay down a solid foundation for the future. Now, the letter is written to a young leader named Timothy, who was basically tasked with fixing all these problems. But it's way more than just personal advice. The source material calls it an operating manual for the entire community, which it calls the House of God. It's so foundational, actually, that it's a key text in a field called ecclesiology, which is just a fancy word for the study of how a church is supposed to be organized and structured. Okay, but before we get into the nuts and bolts of the blueprint, we have to ask a really fascinating question. Who was the actual architect of this thing? For centuries, the answer seemed pretty simple, but modern scholarship has opened up a really compelling debate. On the one hand, you have the traditional view, Pauline authorship. The letter itself says it's from the Apostle Paul, and we know from other texts he had a really close relationship with Timothy. But on the other hand, you have the Deutero-Pauline view. This suggests it was written by a close follower of Paul, maybe after he died. And the clues for this are pretty interesting. The writing style and the vocabulary are different. We're talking about 300 words that don't show up in Paul's other confirmed letters. Plus, the church structure it describes seems a bit more formal and developed, and the timeline of events just doesn't quite line up with the history we have in the Book of Acts. But you know what? Regardless of who actually held the pen, the instructions in this manual are crystal clear. To fix the chaos, the community had to be built on 3 main pillars. And the first, the most important one, was the pillar of doctrine. The number one command to Timothy was to protect what the letter calls sound doctrine. You can basically think of this as the community's constitution, the correct, the healthy, the true teaching of the faith. And this wasn't about winning arguments for the sake of it. This was the primary defense against all those dangerous ideas that were tearing the community apart in Ephesus. And the letter makes it super clear this isn't just some intellectual exercise. The ultimate goal, the whole point of sound doctrine, was to produce a very specific result: love, which comes from a pure heart and a good conscience. In other words, what you believe is supposed to directly change how you behave. So what's the theological core that all this sound doctrine is built on? The letter calls it the mystery of piety. Now, when we hear the word mystery, we think of an unsolvable riddle, right? But back then, a mystery was something different. It was a profound truth that was once hidden, but has now been revealed. And in this case, that big reveal was Jesus Christ. And get this, a lot of scholars think this passage was actually an early Christian hymn. It just beautifully lays out the whole story in 6 powerful lines. It starts with his manifestation in the flesh, that's the incarnation. Then his justification by the Spirit, which points to the resurrection. Then you have his revelation to angels, his proclamation to the world, his acceptance by believers, and finally his exaltation up into glory. So this wasn't just a pretty song. It was the theological bedrock for the entire community. It was everything. All right, so with that foundational belief system firmly in place, the blueprint moves on to the second pillar, the standard for leadership. Because, let's be honest, a community is only as strong as its leaders, right? And here's the absolute game changer. The number one qualification wasn't skill, it wasn't charisma, and it wasn't worldly success. Overwhelmingly, it was about character. The manual pushes this idea that is so key to understanding the mindset back then, that a person's private household was the non-negotiable testing ground for their public life. So when we look at the requirements for the 2 main leadership roles, presbyters and deacons, the emphasis is just, wow, it's striking. Just look at these qualifications. irreproachable, manages his family well, good reputation with outsiders. Now, sure, a presbyter needed to be able to teach, but the vast majority of this list isn't about what they can do, it's about who they are. This quote right here gets to the absolute heart of the logic. The family home was seen as the ultimate proving ground for leadership. The reasoning was super simple and direct. If you can't manage the small, private world of your own home, how on earth could anyone trust you to care for the much larger public world of God's community? I mean, that is a radical standard of integrity. Okay, so you've got sound doctrine and you've got character-driven leadership. Now the manual turns to its third and final pillar, establishing the day-to-day ethic of the community. This is where the blueprint gets into the real nitty-gritty of how people should actually live and interact with each other. Now, this section has one of the most historically debated passages in the whole letter, and it's about the role of women. There are two primary ways people have understood this. The contextual perspective argues that the prohibition on teaching or having authority was a very specific rule for a specific time. Adherents of this view point to that powerful cult of Artemis in Ephesus, which had female leaders and was spreading its own myths. The theory goes that this rule was like a temporary firewall to stop those false teachings from getting in. On the other hand, the complementarian perspective argues that this restriction is a universal principle, because the reasoning the text itself gives isn't about the culture in Ephesus, but about the order of creation. Next up, the manual tackles the community's attitude toward money, and it does it with this really radical idea, a theology of contentment. You have to remember, Ephesus was a booming commercial center. The pursuit of wealth was everything, and this blueprint just completely flips that on its head. It says the greatest gain isn't money, it's godliness with contentment. It's a direct shot at the culture of materialism. And for those in the community who were already wealthy, the instructions were just as direct. They were told, don't be arrogant, and don't put your hope in something as flimsy as money. Instead, their hope was to be in God. And, crucially, their wealth was given a whole new purpose. They were commanded to be rich in good works, to be generous, and to be ready to share what they had. So, after all that, what's the lasting impact of this ancient blueprint? How does it all come together? Well, the manual wraps everything up by framing its entire project with this powerful, enduring metaphor, the legacy of the fight. The final charge to Timothy is to fight the good fight of the faith. Now, this isn't a call to a single battle. It's a metaphor for the entire Christian way of life, a continuous, disciplined struggle that requires perseverance to hold on to everything this manual has laid out. So in the end, when you boil it all down, this blueprint leaves behind a three-part legacy. First, orthodoxy, a firm commitment to sound doctrine. Second, order, a stable structure that's built on leaders of high character. And third, piety, a personal life of contentment and good works. You put those three pillars together, and that was the formula for a community built to last. Which, of course, leaves us with one final question to think about. In our own complex, often chaotic world, can a 2,000-year-old operating manual, with its intense focus on foundational truth, on leadership integrity, and on a countercultural ethic of contentment, can it still serve as a relevant blueprint for building healthy, lasting organizations today?